One quiet and ordinary evening, when life in a residential area of a large city was going on as usual, an incident occurred that would soon shake the entire country. This incident, at first glance unremarkable, revealed deep-rooted problems in the law enforcement system and made people talk about racial discrimination in the police again. What began as a routine check turned into a tragedy, the outcome of which no one could have foreseen. That evening, a patrol officer was on duty on the outskirts of the city. It was a routine shift, and nothing out of the ordinary was expected. The area he was patrolling was known for its ethnic diversity, with African Americans and other ethnic minorities living there. Over the past few weeks, the area had seen a number of minor crimes, such as thefts and vandalism, which had caused some concern among local residents and the police department. As a result, the decision was made to increase patrols. This area was far from crime-ridden. It was populated by ordinary people, families, students, working citizens, going about their daily lives. However, the police had a preconceived notion that such areas required more control. Often, in these places, patrol officers, following internal prejudices, conducted more checks based on racial stereotypes, and although there was no objective reason to believe that crime was higher here, the order to patrol was given. The officer working that shift had been in law enforcement for several years, but during that time he had been accused of excessive force and bias against ethnic minorities. However, none of these allegations led to serious consequences, and he continued to carry out his duties. That night, he went out on patrol again, confident in his professionalism, but his hidden biases would soon play a key role in the tragedy. Meanwhile, a police captain, one of the most respected and experienced officers in the city, was returning home after a long day. The man had proven his competence and dedication over the years. He had an illustrious career, starting as a patrolman and rising to the rank of captain, thanks to his work and unwavering belief in justice. His colleagues described him as a man of honor, who always sought to act within the law and maintain peace in society. He was known as a man who actively supported police reforms aimed at combating racism and bias. The captain was a strong advocate for equality and believed that the police should be a reflection of justice and protection, not an instrument of oppression. It was a typical working day for him, full of meetings, conferences, and discussions of new initiatives to improve police interactions with the community. Tired but satisfied with the day's results, the captain got into his car and drove home. He drove along a familiar route through a neighborhood he knew well. Even though he was in civilian clothes that evening, his car contained all the necessary documents, including his police captain's ID. As he approached the intersection, his attention was drawn to the patrol car driving behind him. The flashing lights came on, followed by a siren, signaling him to stop. The captain, accustomed to such situations, did not attach much importance to this. He calmly parked the car on the side of the road and prepared for a routine check. The patrol officer who stopped him had already made certain conclusions. Seeing an African American behind the wheel, he did not think about who was in front of him. For him, this was another driver whom he suspected of violating the law or acting suspiciously. Instead of immediately finding out the driver's identity or checking his documents, the patrol officer acted based on his preconceived notions. This moment would be a turning point in their lives. The captain, despite his confidence and belief in the system, did not expect to fall victim to the same stereotypes he had fought his entire career against. The patrolman, driven by internal fears and prejudice, did not realize that his actions would lead to tragic consequences. The bad decisions made that night forever changed the lives of everyone involved. This incident became a shining example of how racial prejudice can cost the lives of even those who have dedicated their lives to fighting for justice and the rule of law. The issue of racial discrimination in law enforcement has been the subject of heated debate for decades. In modern America, as in other countries, there is a deep and complex history of relations between police and ethnic minorities, particularly the African American community. This conflict goes back to the distant past, when police played a role in upholding laws directly related to racial inequality, such as Jim Crow laws and segregation practices. The problem of discrimination in policing is not just isolated incidents of misbehavior by individual officers. It is a systemic problem rooted in institutions that have served the interests of privileged groups and unevenly enforced the law against minorities for decades. Research shows that African Americans and other ethnic groups are subject to more frequent police stops, more stringent searches, arrests, and brutal treatment than white citizens. This has become especially evident in recent decades, as numerous cases of police brutality against African Americans have begun to be highlighted in the media and on social media, sparking mass protests and movements such as Black Lives Matter. To understand how incidents like the one involving the police captain were possible, it is necessary to consider the deep historical and social roots of racism in law enforcement. Since their inception, the police have always served as an instrument of power to maintain a certain order. In times when laws were designed to maintain racial hierarchy, the police played a key role in enforcing them. For example, during the era of slavery in the United States, police units, or their prototypes, were tasked with capturing runaway slaves and suppressing any attempts at resistance. After the abolition of slavery and the subsequent Reconstruction, when black citizens began to demand equal rights, the police were still the tool used to suppress them. Segregation laws that legally enshrined inequality were actively enforced by police officers, which ingrained mistrust between the African American population and law enforcement. In the 20th century, as the civil rights movement captured the world's attention, police attitudes toward African Americans remained hostile. Protests and marches aimed at achieving equal rights often resulted in violent clashes with police. An example of this was the bloody events in Selma, Alabama in 1965, when peaceful protesters were brutally beaten by police for trying to achieve voting rights for black people. Current research and statistics confirm that racial bias in policing remains a serious problem. Analyses of stop, arrest, and use of force data show that African Americans and Latinos are significantly more likely to be the targets of suspicion and police brutality. For example, a 2019 study found that African Americans in the United States are stopped by police at twice the rate of white citizens, even in the absence of a violation. These numbers confirm that bias is not random, but part of a systematic approach built into the structure of law enforcement. Many cases of police brutality involving African American victims have gained widespread publicity in recent years, thanks to advances in technology and the proliferation of video footage. Videos of police violence, such as the George Floyd incident in 2020, have sparked outrage around the world. These incidents have shown that the problem is global and requires fundamental changes in police culture and training, but the problem goes deeper than just isolated incidents. There are clear signs that cultural and institutional biases play a role in how police officers interact with minorities. Many officers, like the one who pulled over the police captain in this case, are unaware of their implicit biases and often act on intuitive judgments that are shaped by their personal experiences and societal stereotypes. These biases can manifest themselves in everyday situations, such as when an officer sees an African American driving an expensive car and automatically assumes that the person may be involved in criminal activity. The problem is compounded by the fact that internal police controls often do not work properly. Many incidents of racial bias go unpunished, and officers found to have engaged in such behavior continue to serve without serious consequences. This creates a climate of impunity that reinforces the belief among some officers that they can act on biased judgments without fear of repercussions. The incident involving the police captain was just one more example of how dangerous these hidden biases can be. The officer who pulled the captain over did not see a fellow officer, a man with years of experience and the rank of captain, in front of him. He saw only an African American driver, which made him instantly suspicious. And that suspicion, reinforced by years of systematic bias, led to tragic consequences. The police captain who was the victim of the tragic incident was known as an outstanding officer with an impeccable reputation and many years of experience in law enforcement. His name was Michael Williams, and during his 25 years of service, he had built a career that many could only dream of. He rose from a rank-and-file patrolman to captain, earning the respect of not only his colleagues, but also the citizens of the city he served. Michael was born and raised in this city, in a tough area where crime and violence were a part of everyday life. He saw his peers getting caught up in a life of drugs, theft, and street fights. However, he always believed that he could choose a different path and help his community become a better place. From a young age, Michael strove for justice and order. He was inspired by stories of people who, despite difficult circumstances, managed to change their lives and the lives of others. His desire to become a police officer was not accidental. He saw how the police were often perceived in his community as a threat rather than a protector. However, Michael believed that this dynamic could be changed. He dreamed of becoming an officer who would act with integrity and fairness, supporting those in need and serving as an example to young people. His goal was not just to maintain order, but to change the way people view the police, to show that law enforcement can be on the side of citizens, not against them. After finishing school, Michael went to college, where he studied criminology and psychology, seeking to better understand the nature of crime and how to prevent it. His studies helped him develop skills that would later prove invaluable in his career. The ability to understand the motivations of criminals, work with conflicts, and find approaches to different social groups. Michael was ambitious, but at the same time remained an incredibly humble person, always putting the interests of others above his own. After graduating from college, he joined the police force. During his early years, Michael was confronted with a harsh reality. Racism and bias within law enforcement were no less acute than on the streets he patrolled. As one of the few African Americans in his department, he often faced sidelong glances and doubts from his colleagues. He had to prove his competence and professionalism doubly in order to gain recognition and respect. Despite this, Michael never lost faith that he could change the system from within through his actions. One of his first great successes was as a patrolman in the rough neighborhoods where he grew up. Knowing the streets and their residents better than anyone else, he was able to quickly establish trust between the police and the community. Instead of using force and threats, Michael built relationships with the locals, often going out of uniform, just as one of them. He knew that fighting crime couldn't be limited to arrests and punishments. It was more important to create an environment in which young people would not turn to crime as an outlet. Over the years, Michael has proven himself to be an expert in negotiations and conflict prevention. His ability to find an approach to people, even in the most tense situations, has repeatedly helped to avoid bloodshed. His superiors often noted that in situations where other officers might resort to force, Michael always found a way to resolve the conflict peacefully. This made him well known and respected not only among the police, but also among ordinary citizens. People knew that if Captain Williams arrived on the scene, they could expect a fair and honest solution. His commitment to reform did not go unnoticed. Michael became a vocal advocate for changes within the police force that focused on better training officers in racial sensitivity and communication with different ethnic groups. He advocated for new programs that would teach officers to manage their biases and help them build more trusting relationships with their communities. Michael believed that change was possible if it was initiated from within the system. One of the highlights of his career was his work as the head of the Community Relations Department. In this role, he led a number of initiatives aimed at improving the police's interactions with different ethnic and social groups. Under his leadership, the police began to implement programs aimed at preventing crime among young people, developing sports and educational programs for teenagers, and improving the interaction between police and citizens. Michael was committed to ensuring that people saw the police not as an enemy, but as an ally. But despite all his achievements and contribution to improving police work, Michael remained a modest person. He rarely talked about his merits, preferring to let his work speak for him. His colleagues spoke of him as a person who was always ready to help, support with advice or action. Family was an important part of his life, and he tried to spend all his free time with his wife and children. For his children, he was an example of strength, honor, and fortitude. And it was this man, who had come such a long and difficult way, who on that fateful night became a victim of prejudiced stereotypes and unconscious racism. Captain Williams knew how to work with conflicts, how to find a common language with people, but even his outstanding skills and achievements could not save him from a tragic fate when the system he had spent his whole life trying to improve betrayed him. That evening, Michael was driving home from a long day at work. He was tired, but pleased with the results of his work. He had just finished a meeting to discuss new initiatives to improve community policing. He knew there was still work to do, but he believed in himself and that change was possible. Michael got into his car, not suspecting that in a few minutes his life would change forever. At this point, his career and life should have followed the usual path: home, to his family, to another day full of plans and work. But an encounter with a biased policeman ruined all his plans and forever changed not only his fate, but also the fate of those around him. The patrol officer who became one of the key participants in the tragedy was far from new to law enforcement. His name was James Miller, and at the time of the incident, he had been on the force for more than a decade. During that time, he had accumulated some experience working on the city streets. But at the same time, his career had been marred by several controversial cases involving abuse of power and racial bias. James Miller was born in a small suburban town where the overwhelming majority of the population was white Americans. His upbringing and the environment in which he grew up did not include a great deal of cultural and ethnic diversity, which partly influenced his perception of people of other races and ethnicities. He grew up in a family that valued tradition, discipline, and respect for authority. His father served in the army, and his mother was a schoolteacher. From an early age, James was accustomed to the idea that order and adherence to rules are the basis of a stable society. After finishing school, James decided to follow in his father's footsteps and join the army, where he spent several years. He liked the discipline and structure of the military and was confident that he could continue his career in law enforcement. After leaving the army, he decided to enroll in the police academy. Police service seemed like a natural extension of his military career, another way to maintain order and protect society. When James graduated from the academy, he was full of enthusiasm and a desire to serve the community. His first years of service were relatively uneventful. He performed patrol duties, responded to calls, filled out paperwork, and learned to work in an urban environment. However, it soon became clear that his military background, with its strict rules and clear hierarchy, was not always suitable for working with civilians. It took James a while to realize that police work was different from the army. In addition to strength and discipline, police work required flexibility, empathy, and the ability to work with different social groups. But these skills were difficult for him to master. He tended to take a hard-nosed approach, often relying on force and authority rather than diplomacy and communication. This was evident in his work with the public, especially with ethnic minorities, whom he perceived through the prism of stereotypes that had been ingrained in his mind since childhood. Over the course of several years in the police force, James gained a reputation as a tough and principled officer. He was not afraid to use force if he considered it necessary, and often went beyond his authority, believing that maintaining order was the main thing that was required of him. His colleagues initially saw him as a reliable person who was always ready to lend a shoulder in a difficult situation. However, gradually, cases began to emerge where his actions raised questions. His first serious incident occurred 5 years into his service, when James became involved in a dispute with a young African-American man he had pulled over for a traffic violation. During a paperwork check, the situation quickly spiraled out of control when James began to aggressively demand compliance, despite the driver not being aggressive. As a result, the trooper resorted to force, pulling the driver out of the car and handcuffing him. It was later discovered that the driver had no prior violations and had been wrongly accused. The incident made local news, and the police launched an internal investigation. However, James was not seriously punished. The incident was hushed up, and his actions were attributed to a misinterpretation of the situation. This was the first warning sign, but it was far from the last. Over the next few years, James found himself at the center of several conflicts involving the use of force against ethnic minorities. In each case, his behavior was questionable, but thanks to the support of his colleagues and the absence of clear evidence of bias, each case ended without serious consequences for him. He remained in the service, although each time his reputation among the population worsened. Some of his colleagues began to notice that James tended to be suspicious of African Americans and Hispanics. He was more likely to stop cars driven by these ethnic groups and was harsher on them than on white citizens. This behavior often went unnoticed or was ignored because it did not go beyond overt violations. But within the force, many knew he had hidden biases, but James never considered himself a racist. He saw his job as fighting crime and danger, and in his mind, if there were more minorities in a neighborhood, that automatically meant there was a higher likelihood of encountering criminals. He didn't realize that his perception was deeply rooted in stereotypes he'd absorbed in his youth, and that were reinforced by his colleagues and the culture within the police department. When it came to that fateful night, James was on patrol in a neighborhood he had long considered problematic. It was heavily African American, and while there was no concrete evidence of high crime rates, James always felt wary when he worked in the area. He felt that any car, especially one driven by an African American, could be linked to trouble. That night, James was driving his usual route when he noticed Captain Williams's car. He didn't know who was driving, but what caught his attention was that the car seemed too expensive for the area. A stereotype immediately popped into James's head. A black man driving an expensive car in a poor area is suspicious. He decided to stop the car to check it out. It was a decision based not on facts or violations, but on an intuitive bias that had been ingrained in him over the years. In that moment, James did not see before him a police captain, a man with decades of experience, but only a potential threat, a man he believed might be a criminal. The incident occurred on one of those ordinary weekday evenings when the city settles into its usual bustle and evening rituals. People were returning from work, streetlights were lit along the perimeter of the roads, and patrol cars began their nightly routes through the patrol areas. The area where the tragic clash took place was a quiet suburban place, known for its multi-ethnicity and history of social inequality. The area was located on the southeastern edge of the city, and despite its reputation as a bedroom community, there was always an air of anxiety about the neighborhood. On the one hand, it was home to many ordinary families who valued peace and stability, but locals could not ignore the fact that the area was often the subject of close police attention. The neighborhood was populated primarily by African Americans and Latinos, many of whom were middle class or working class. Although official statistics showed that the crime rate here was no higher than in other areas, police patrols were still a frequent occurrence. This part of the city, like many other areas with a high percentage of ethnic minorities, was under close scrutiny from law enforcement. The reasons ranged from old prejudices to suspicions that petty crime might flourish there. It is important to understand that the area was not a ghetto and did not suffer from overt crime. Rather, its reputation was formed by stereotypes and the discontent of local authorities. The streets of this area looked typical of suburban America: narrow alleys, single-story houses with small, well-kept yards where locals tried to maintain at least a modicum of order and comfort. Some houses were freshly painted, indicating people's desire to improve their living conditions. Other houses, on the contrary, looked abandoned or dilapidated. Their windows were boarded up, indicating the dire situation of some families. That evening, with the sun already setting, the area was immersed in semi-darkness. The streetlights along the roads cast a soft glow on the sidewalks, but darkness reigned between the houses and trees. The locals were busy with their own affairs. Someone was walking their dogs, children were playing in empty playgrounds, and rare cars were slowly moving along the road. It was an ordinary, unremarkable time for everyone who lived in this area. However, for the police, this place always seemed suspicious, especially at night. It was here, at one of the intersections, that the fatal event began. The intersection where Patrolman Miller stopped Captain Williams' car was located at the junction of two main roads in the area. It was an ordinary intersection with one traffic light and small stores on the corners. One of them, a grocery store, was known among locals as a place where you could buy everything you needed. It was open until late in the evening, and at that moment, several customers were inside, making purchases. On the other side of the road was an abandoned auto repair shop, which had once been an important part of the local infrastructure, but had lost its significance over time and was closed. Its facade was covered in graffiti, and its windows had long been broken. Time seemed to have stopped there, and its abandonment contrasted with the active life of the area's residents. The road itself was relatively narrow, with parking spaces along the sidewalks. Cars rarely passed through, especially in the evening, and so Captain Williams' stop attracted the attention of a few bystanders. Some of them would later become important witnesses to the events that took place at this intersection. The weather that evening was typical of autumn in the region, cool and damp. A light fog was beginning to creep along the road, making the surrounding atmosphere even more oppressive. Leaves that had recently fallen from the trees lay on the ground, rising into the air with every gust of wind. This fog added to the feeling of isolation and gloom of the situation. Michael Williams, a police captain, was driving along this road on his way home from a busy day on the job. He had stayed late that evening, discussing with colleagues a new community policing program he had initiated. He felt satisfied with the work he had done and was looking forward to returning home to his family. In the back seat of his car was a briefcase filled with documents, including materials on police reforms, as well as his police badge, identification card, and awards for his many years of impeccable service. Michael was a man who took pride in his rank and duties, but at this moment, he was just a citizen returning home after a hard day at work. When Trooper Miller saw Captain Williams' car, his attention was drawn to the expensive make of the car and the black driver behind the wheel. It was a standard moment for Miller, who often based his suspicions on external signs rather than actual violations. The area, the car, the driver, all of it made him instantly suspicious. He turned on his siren and flashing lights to stop the car for inspection. Michael Williams, seeing that he had been pulled over, calmly parked on the side of the road. This was a routine occurrence for him. Over the years, he had encountered similar situations many times, both as an officer and as a citizen. However, this time, things went differently. At that moment, the roads were almost empty. Only a few cars drove by, not paying attention to what was happening. A few pedestrians, noticing the stopped police car, slowed down, but did not attach much importance to it. Stopping a car for inspection is a common occurrence in this area. No one knew that soon a tragic event would occur here that would change the lives of many. When James Miller's police cruiser turned on its siren and lights, Captain Michael Williams, a conscientious citizen and longtime police officer, responded immediately. He calmly pulled over and stopped the vehicle. It was standard procedure, something Michael, as a police captain, had seen many times throughout his career. He knew it was important to remain calm and cooperate with the patrolmen in such situations. However, he never imagined that this test would end in tragedy. Michael was in civilian clothes, returning home from work. His uniform and badge were in his office, but his police captain's badge and identification were in the front seat of his car, ready for presentation. He was confident that the matter would be resolved quickly once the patrolman saw his papers. Miller pulled up behind the captain's car and turned on his headlights, illuminating the rear of Williams's vehicle. Williams got out of his car and walked toward the driver's door. At that moment, he had no idea that there was a police captain in front of him. He only saw an African-American man driving an expensive car, which made him instantly suspicious. Miller felt like he might be dealing with a violator, even though there was no obvious reason to stop him. As he approached the car, James instinctively placed his hand on his gun holster. It was a standard precaution, but in this case, it was dictated by his underlying biases and mistrust. The situation had been suspicious to him from the start. Late at night, an African-American driver, no obvious factors other than his own biases. Although Miller might have started with a routine ID check, his behavior immediately became more wary. Approaching the car, James tapped on the window, gesturing for the driver to roll it down. Michael calmly complied. He knew that in such situations it was important to behave correctly and respectfully. However, noticing the wariness in the policeman's behavior, the captain became slightly wary, although he tried not to attach any importance to it. He had encountered such an attitude more than once in his life, especially in his youth, but he always believed in justice and the law. Michael quickly took out his ID and badge to show who he was. He expected that once James saw that he was not just a driver but a police captain, the situation would be resolved. However, the reality was different. James glanced at the documents, but instead of being reassured, his suspicions only grew. He wasn't sure if this was a police officer. His bias and years of skepticism about members of the African-American community clouded his objective perception of the situation. Thoughts began to swirl in Miller's mind that it might be a fake ID. He had encountered fake documents many times before, and he was prepared for the possibility that the driver might be involved in criminal activity. Miller decided he needed to continue checking to make sure he wasn't a fraud. He asked Michael to get out of the car, which was a surprise turn of events for the captain. Michael was sure that everything was cleared up. His documents confirmed his identity, and no further action was required. However, the demand to get out of the car indicated that the situation was starting to get out of control. At first, Michael tried to explain that he was a police captain and that his documents were genuine. He remained calm, believing that the patrolman would soon realize his mistake. However, Miller was becoming increasingly convinced that he was right. To him, the situation looked suspicious, and his actions began to shift from standard procedures to more severe measures. Feeling the tension, Michael finally complied and got out of the car. He knew that in such situations, the main thing is not to create conflict and to follow the police officer's instructions, even if they seemed unfair. Michael never expected that as a police officer, he would find himself in such a situation, but he believed that everything would soon be resolved. However, as Michael stepped out of the car, he noticed the patrolman take out handcuffs and start walking toward him. This was the last straw. Michael could not believe that they were going to detain him, a police captain, without any reason. His voice, which had been calm and confident, became firmer. He reminded the patrolman of his rank again and showed his ID, but James was already too wrapped up in his suspicions and fears. He saw not an officer of the law, but a threat that needed to be eliminated. At this point, the situation escalated sharply. Michael, still hoping for a reasonable resolution to the conflict, tried to maintain control over himself, but James had already decided to act further. In his opinion, he was dealing with a potential criminal, and all the driver's actions seemed suspicious to him. The situation quickly escalated after Captain Michael Williams stepped out of his car. Officer James Miller no longer saw the captain as a colleague or as a fellow law enforcement officer. All he saw was an African-American man driving an expensive car who he thought needed to be arrested. Miller's suspicions grew, even though there was no factual basis for them. Hidden prejudices and a lifetime of fear of ethnic minorities clouded his ability to assess the situation objectively. When Michael got out of the car, he carried himself with dignity and confidence. He had dealt with many difficult situations as a police captain, and he always believed that calm and reason were the keys to resolving any conflict. But this time, he had encountered something completely different. Not professionalism, but outright bias. Michael knew that there had been few such moments in his career, but each one had left a deep mark, a reminder that even his high status could not always protect him from racism. James Miller, seeing Michael exit the car, continued to insist that he take further action. He ordered Williams to raise his hands and stand by the hood of the car. This request clearly went beyond a standard ID check, especially since Michael had already produced identification. But that wasn't enough for Miller. He was convinced he was dealing with someone who could pose a threat, and he acted on his misperception of the situation. Michael, while remaining outwardly calm, was in shock at what was happening. He had never thought that he would find himself in a position where he would be suspected of wrongdoing, especially when he was wearing a genuine police uniform. He knew that the situation was quickly spiraling out of control, but despite this, he still hoped for a reasonable resolution. He obeyed the patrolman's instructions and slowly raised his hands as James demanded. Still, the tension was building. Miller, seeing Michael comply, took it as confirmation of his suspicions. He didn't realize that his actions were only pushing the situation toward inevitable escalation. His voice grew harsher, his movements more aggressive. He again demanded that Michael stand by the hood of the car, but this time, the captain felt his patience was wearing thin. Michael, accustomed to acting like a professional, decided that he could no longer remain silent. He addressed James again, this time more insistently, repeating that he was a police captain and that his documents were genuine. His voice was firm, but not aggressive. He knew that if he did not explain the situation now, the consequences could be extremely negative. However, James was not in the mood to listen. The thought that he was facing a potential criminal who was trying to hide behind forged documents still dominated his mind. At that moment, James decided that he needed to act more decisively. He moved closer to Michael, his hand touching the holster with the gun again. This movement did not escape the captain's attention. Michael, as a man who had served in the police for many years, knew that the situation was starting to become dangerous. He understood that any action he took now could be perceived incorrectly, and he tried to remain calm. but the internal anxiety was growing. He saw that Miller was clearly not in the mood for constructive dialogue, and his actions were becoming more and more aggressive. Meanwhile, bystanders, noticing the escalation, began to slow down, watching what was happening. Some of them pulled out their phones, trying to film the events. Several people stopped on the opposite side of the street, not understanding what was happening, but clearly sensing the tension. All of this only added to the pressure on Michael, who was now under the watchful eye of both the police officer and bystanders. James, seeing that the situation was becoming public, began to act even more harshly. He pulled out the handcuffs and stepped forward, intending to detain Michael. For him, this was no longer just a routine arrest. It had become a matter of principle. He was confident that he could handle the suspect, and he did not want to back down. In his eyes, this was a move that was supposed to confirm his power and control over the situation. Michael couldn't believe his eyes. He saw before him a man who refused to acknowledge reality and was ready to act against him only because of his skin color and false suspicions. The captain felt his patience wearing thin. He tried to explain the situation again, this time with desperation in his voice, but James wasn't listening. He was focused on his goal, to apprehend the man he had mistakenly believed to be the intruder. Michael, under enormous pressure, made another attempt to reach the patrolman by showing him his papers. He hoped that this was his last chance to avoid further conflict. But Miller was already too caught up in his own preconceived notions. He grabbed Michael's arm and began to forcefully handcuff him, ignoring his explanations. At that moment, everything changed. Michael, feeling the violence and injustice, tried to break free. His instincts kicked in. He couldn't allow himself to be treated like this. Even though he knew that any attempt at resistance would only make things worse, he couldn't remain passive any longer. This reaction became the point of no return for both of them. James took the movement as a threat. He immediately took a step back, instinctively drawing his gun. It all happened in a matter of seconds. He saw before him not a colleague, not a police captain, but a man who, in his opinion, posed a threat to his life. At that moment, Miller was completely overwhelmed by his fear and prejudice. Michael froze when he saw the gun. He couldn't believe that the situation had gone this far. His heart started beating faster, and all his thoughts were focused on one thing: how to avoid further escalation. But it was too late. The situation had gotten out of control, and both parties were too involved to take a step back. The moment James Miller pulled out his gun was the culmination of the mounting tension. Those few seconds when the gun was in his hands were decisive and changed the course of events. In that moment, very different images appeared before the eyes of both participants. For Michael Williams, it was shock and incomprehension as a situation that should have been a simple ID check escalated into outright violence. For James Miller, on the other hand, it was confirmation of his worst fears. Here stood a suspect who he believed might resist or even attack him. Those few seconds passed in slow motion. Michael froze in place as he saw the patrolman point a gun at him. His first thought was that this was a mistake. He tried to comprehend that despite all his accomplishments and years of service to the police, he was now in the crosshairs of his own colleague. This was something he could never have foreseen, not even in his worst nightmares. He had experienced bias, disrespect, and mistrust before, but for it to lead to this situation was something he had never imagined. The question in his mind was, how could this have happened? James Miller felt the adrenaline coursing through his body as he held the gun. His hands were shaking slightly, but he was trying to maintain control. In his mind, this was no longer a routine traffic stop. This was a direct confrontation with what he perceived as a potential threat to his life. James was sure that there was a man in front of him who might try to attack him, and he had to protect himself. His brain had stopped perceiving Captain Williams as a police officer. It only saw an African-American man who, in his mind, was dangerous. This stereotype was so deeply ingrained in James's mind that even the documents he was presented with could not break his erroneous perception. Michael understood that any move he made in this situation could be fatal. He tried to remain absolutely calm, trying not to provoke Miller. Michael slowly raised his hands up, trying to show that he had no weapon, that he did not pose a threat. But his gestures, which in another situation could have diffused the situation, were perceived by James differently. James began yelling, ordering Michael to get on the ground. His voice was filled with anxiety and aggression, which only added to the tension. Michael, although he knew he had to follow the officer's orders, felt that the situation had already gone beyond reasonable limits. It was humiliating for him, a police captain, to be ordered to detain him in this way. But he knew that refusing to comply could lead to more violence. People began to gather around. Passers-by, who had previously been simply observing what was happening now, began actively recording everything on their phones. Many of them did not know who Michael Williams was and could only guess what was happening. But one thing was clear: the tension was growing with each passing second. The streets, where there was usually silence, were now in chaos. At some point, when Michael began to move slowly to lie down on the ground, James perceived this movement as aggression. He felt that the situation was getting out of his control and instinctively pulled the trigger. The shot rang out in the silence of the night, echoing through the streets. The moment froze. Everyone around him, passers-by, drivers, observers, froze in shock. It seemed as if time itself had stopped. Michael felt the bullet hit him in the chest. Pain shot through his entire body. He staggered and fell to the asphalt, trying to stay on his feet, but his strength quickly left him. The ground, which had seemed solid and reliable until then, suddenly became distant and cold. He, the police captain, the defender of law and order, lay on the ground, gasping for breath and realizing that his life was quickly slipping away. Everything that happened next seemed like a dream to Michael. He heard people screaming, people running, someone calling for an ambulance. He couldn't believe that this was happening to him. He had one question in his head. Why? Why didn't this officer see him as a colleague, but only as a threat? Why did his life of dedication and service to society have to end so absurdly? Meanwhile, James Miller stood frozen with the gun in his hands, realizing what had just happened. The adrenaline was beginning to subside, and the realization of what he had done was slowly dawning on him. His hands were still shaking, but now it was no longer from fear, but from shock. He had just shot a police captain, a man who posed no threat. Fragments of thoughts began to flicker through his mind, but none of them brought him any relief. This was irreparable. Miller slowly approached Michael, who was lying on the ground, bleeding. He saw before him a man who, just a moment ago, was alive, talking, trying to make contact, but now this man was on the verge of death. James stood motionless, unable to understand what to do next. His voice inside him told him one thing: he had made a mistake, but the reality was too hard to accept. Slowly, more police officers began to arrive on the scene. The screams, commotion, and chaos continued to mount, but it no longer mattered to Michael. His consciousness was slowly fading, and he no longer felt pain. His last gaze was directed at the sky, where there were no stars, no clouds, only endless darkness. He knew that his life had ended in a way he could never have imagined. Meanwhile, reporters began flocking to the scene, hearing about the gunshots and the police officer involved. The blood stain on the pavement, the fallen body of the police captain, and the gun in the hands of his colleague became the center of attention, and within a few hours, the incident would be covered by all the news channels. James Miller's mistaken actions changed his life forever. He made a fatal mistake based on his biases, fears, and poor judgment. The bullet he fired not only ended Michael Williams's life, but also called into question the entire system Miller represented. When James Miller's bullet hit Captain Michael Williams in the chest, time seemed to slow down. It was a fateful moment that would determine the fate of both participants in the incident. Michael staggered and sank to the ground, pressing his hand to the wound from which blood was rapidly flowing. His face, a moment ago full of confidence and calm, now expressed a mixture of pain, shock, and incomprehension. It all happened too fast. For Michael, this was the very moment when the world around him became alien and cruel, and the system to which he dedicated his entire life turned against him. Michael lay on the cold asphalt, his breathing uneven and heavy. He felt the life leaving his body with each passing second. The cries of passers-by, the noise of cars and muffled footsteps sounded dull in his ears. Thoughts raced through his head, about his family, about his children whom he would never see again, about his wife who would be devastated by this loss. Michael was an officer who had seen a lot in his life, but this outcome was unthinkable for him. Amidst the chaos, James Miller stood motionless, as if paralyzed by the horror of what had just happened. His hands were still holding the gun, but now they were shaking. His mind was in chaos. He had just shot a man, and not just any man, but his colleague, a police captain. The realization was like a blow to the chest. He couldn't believe that his own actions had led to such a tragedy. Everything that had happened in the last few minutes now seemed unreal to James, like a bad dream from which he could not wake up. The crowd around was beginning to thicken. People who had been watching the conflict from a safe distance were now in shock. Some of them immediately rushed to help Michael. Someone tried to call an ambulance. Someone shouted indignant words at Miller, blaming him for what happened. Several people were already filming the incident on their phones. Their recordings would soon fly around social networks, going viral. The world would see this tragic moment and start asking questions. Meanwhile, Michael continued to fight for his life. He heard snippets of conversation, felt people trying to support him on the ground. Someone was telling him, "Hang in there, we've called for help, you can do it." But deep down, Michael knew his time was running out. His consciousness was slowly fading, and every breath was a huge struggle. At some point, he stopped feeling pain. His body was weakening, giving in to the encroaching darkness. For James Miller, every second seemed like an eternity. His training, his preparation as a police officer, all his skills were useless in that moment. He stood like a stone statue, his face white with terror. Everything he knew about the job, about service, about justice, collapsed in an instant. Miller couldn't move. He couldn't find the strength to even approach Michael to make sure he was still alive. Fear paralyzed him completely. At that moment, he already realized the depth of his mistake, but he could do nothing to correct it. Suddenly, more police officers began arriving at the scene. Sirens could be heard. Patrol cars were pulling up one after another. The situation had become public, and now it could no longer be hidden or hushed up. The officers who arrived at the scene did not understand what had happened at first. When they saw Michael Williams, their colleague, lying on the ground, they immediately rushed to him, trying to provide first aid. One of the officers, recognizing Michael, screamed into the radio, demanding immediate medical attention. "It's Williams! It's the captain! Damn it, we're going to lose him!" The officer's voice sounded, filled with despair. Meanwhile, the ambulance was already on its way, but time was ticking away. Every minute seemed like an eternity. The paramedics arrived after a few minutes, which seemed like an eternity for Michael. They immediately began to provide assistance, trying to stabilize his condition. But the situation was critical. The bullet fired by Miller had damaged vital organs, and the chances of survival were rapidly diminishing. Michael was lifted onto a stretcher, his face pale, his breathing shallow. There was chaos all around, police, medics, a crowd of people, everyone trying to do something. But for Michael, time had already stopped. In the last moment, before he lost consciousness completely, his thoughts turned to his family. He hoped that they would never see him like this, lying on the ground, under the lights of police cars, surrounded by panic and fear. He had always been their protector, strong and reliable. And now, in these last moments, he felt like he was letting them down. Meanwhile, James Miller was still standing on the sidelines, unable to get closer to what was happening. His colleagues approached him, asking what had happened, but he could barely answer. There was only one question in his head. How could he have let this happen? How did his bias and fear lead him to shoot his colleague? That question would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the ambulance drove away, taking Michael to the hospital, the crowd remained in place, and the police continued to block off the streets. The scene became a real tragedy, captured on dozens of videos that have already spread across the internet. News services quickly began covering the incident, and soon the entire country learned about the tragic incident that occurred between two police officers. Meanwhile, James Miller was pulled aside by his colleagues. His face was completely blank, his gaze focused on nothing. He was completely disconnected from what was happening around him. The reality seemed too harsh and painful to accept. Miller knew that his career was over, his life was ruined, and most importantly, he had just taken the life of a man who deserved his respect and trust. Medics fought to save Michael Williams' life, but his injuries were too severe. Soon, news came from the hospital that the police captain had died from his injuries. The news hit every news channel and social media like a hammer blow. The city was shocked that one of its most respected police officers had been killed by mistake. There was a wave of protests, outrage, and discussions about how this could have happened. That fateful moment changed everything. For James Miller, for Michael Williams' family, for the police, and for society. A mistaken decision based on bias and fear led to a tragedy that could not be undone. The news of Captain Michael Williams' death spread across the city with astonishing speed. For many, it came as a shock, leaving them bewildered and angry. The murder of a respected police officer, who had dedicated his life to protecting people and fighting injustice at the hands of his own colleague, was a tragedy that went beyond a normal conflict at work. It shook the community, calling into question not only the actions of the officer in question, but the very system he represented. When the news reached the police department, the atmosphere among Michael Williams's colleagues was subdued. For many, it was a personal loss. Williams was not just a captain, but a mentor, a friend, a man who helped young officers navigate the profession and always stood up for justice. Many knew him as a man who fought for change in the police force, for building trust between law enforcement and communities, especially on issues of racial bias. The irony of his death at the hands of a colleague, caused by the bias he was trying to protect others from, was too poignant. The day after the incident, the city's police stations were surrounded by reporters, journalists, and television crews. The headlines of the news outlets were full of headlines. Police captain killed by mistake by patrolman. Fatal mistake or racial bias. Tragedy in the police. Who is to blame? The news stories immediately drew public attention to how such a terrible event could have happened. At first, police brass tried to keep the information within their jurisdiction, issuing cautious statements and urging people not to jump to conclusions until the investigation was complete. However, it soon became apparent that the situation could no longer be controlled. Videos taken by witnesses of the incident spread across social media at incredible speed. These recordings showed an armed James Miller confronting Captain Williams, how things escalated into a confrontation, and how a shot ultimately took the captain's life. These images caused a wave of indignation among ordinary citizens. Community groups and activists immediately raised questions about systemic problems in policing. Black activists began organizing rallies and protests, accusing the police of institutional racism and impunity. The discussions centered on how racial bias continues to influence law enforcement, even among high-ranking and respected officers. The first protest began almost immediately after news of Michael Williams' death broke. The hashtag #JusticeForMichael spread across social media, quickly going viral. It was important not only to pay tribute to the fallen captain, but also to draw attention to a wider issue. How the police, created to protect people, sometimes become a source of violence and injustice, especially towards ethnic minorities. Thousands of people took to the streets with signs and banners demanding answers from the police. Slogans like, "No justice, no peace," and "The system must change" were heard on every street corner. People of all ages and races gathered to express their outrage. For them, the death of Michael Williams became a symbol that even those who have dedicated their lives to fighting injustice are not immune to systemic discrimination. It became an occasion for discussion not only about this particular case, but also about issues of police brutality, bias, and lack of reform. Michael Williams's family was in deep grief. His wife and children were shocked not only by the death of their husband and father, but also by the public and media response. To them, Michael was more than just a police officer. He was their rock, their protector, their role model of strength and courage. Their loss was unspeakably hard, and now they had to cope not only with grief, but also with the public and media attention. Michael's funeral was attended not only by his colleagues and friends, but also by thousands of ordinary citizens who wanted to pay their respects to a man who dedicated his life to public service. The ceremony was filled with deep sorrow and grief that his life was cut short so tragically and unfairly. Speeches from his friends, colleagues, and family members reminded everyone of the kind of person Michael was: fair, honest, devoted to his profession and his community. Meanwhile, the police's internal investigation was gathering momentum. James Miller was immediately suspended from service, and his actions on the night of the tragedy became the subject of a thorough investigation. There were more questions than answers. Why didn't he recognize Michael? Why didn't he trust his ID? Why did he immediately decide that he was dealing with a criminal and not a colleague? These questions became central to the investigation and caused a wide public outcry. The pressure on the police grew with each passing day. In parallel to the internal investigation, an external investigation began. Independent experts, lawyers, and human rights organizations demanded a full and transparent investigation into the incident. Many argued that the incident was not just a tragic mistake, but a symptom of a deeper problem: systemic racism and a lack of accountability in the police force. Each day brought new details and comments. Police unions tried to defend James Miller, claiming that his actions were caused by stress and the dangerous situation. However, this only added fuel to the fire. Public opinion was heating up, and many were convinced that it was not stress, but deep-rooted prejudices that led to such a tragic outcome. Soon, discussions began at the federal level about the need for police reform, which would include better training for officers, a focus on race, and increased accountability for law enforcement misconduct. Politicians began proposing legislative changes to prevent similar incidents from happening again. But for many people, this was just the beginning of a long road to justice. The response to the killing of Captain Michael Williams extended far beyond the city, catalyzing a national conversation about policing and forcing the public to think hard about how racial bias continues to shape life and death in America today. The moment when information about the tragedy involving Captain Michael Williams reached the media was a turning point. The media immediately picked up the story, and within hours it was spread across all news channels and social networks. The event caused a wide public outcry and became a subject of discussion in homes, on the streets, and in the offices of politicians. Every detail of the incident became the object of close attention from journalists and the public, turning a personal tragedy into a national scandal. Television networks began covering the story from different angles. News feeds on major national channels flashed images from the scene of the tragedy. Police cars with their lights flashing, medics trying to save Captain Williams' life. A crowd gathered around the scene. These images were accompanied by emotional commentary from journalists who emphasized that the victim was a respected police captain, fatally shot by his own colleague. Newspapers and news sites also took notice. Leading national outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post published articles with headlines like "Tragic Mistake, Police Captain Killed by Colleague," and "Police Under Fire After Captain's Killing." The articles analyzed the situation in depth, provided historical context for the problem of racial bias in policing, and featured expert commentary condemning both the actions of James Miller and the deeper systemic problems. However, it was not only traditional media that played a key role in shaping public opinion. Social media became a major driver of information dissemination and mobilization of people to express their position. Within hours of the tragedy, the hashtag #JusticeForMichael became one of the most popular on Twitter and other platforms. People shared their thoughts, videos from the scene, as well as personal stories related to discrimination and police brutality. Many social media users expressed their emotions through colorful, often angry comments. They accused the police of failing to address issues of racism and bias, demanded justice for Michael Williams and his family, and demanded radical reforms in law enforcement. Important public figures, journalists, and politicians played an important role in spreading information, joining the conversation, calling for a fair investigation and accountability for those responsible. Protest movements that have been actively developing over the past few years, such as Black Lives Matter, immediately responded to what happened. Activists began organizing marches and rallies across the country, using the story of Michael Williams as further evidence that the police system needs radical reform. Loud slogans of "Justice for Michael" and "Reform or Revolution" were heard on the streets of major cities. Protesters demanded an overhaul of law enforcement policies, better training for officers, and the eradication of racial prejudice. The media also began actively inviting experts, human rights activists, and former police officers to discuss the issue. Some argued that James Miller's actions were the result of insufficient training and the excessive stress that police officers often experience on duty. Others pointed to the systemic nature of the problem, emphasizing that Miller acted not only out of fear, but also because of racial stereotypes ingrained in police culture. Many human rights organizations expressed their outrage at the incident. They claimed that this case was just the tip of the iceberg, and that underneath there was a huge problem that affected all law enforcement agencies. In their statements, they pointed to numerous cases where minorities became victims of police brutality and called for an immediate review of police practices. The influence of the media on public perception of the situation was enormous. Debates were ongoing on television and in newspapers. Politicians, lawyers, human rights experts discussed how to prevent similar tragedies from happening again. Particular attention was paid to the training of police officers. Lack of training related to racial sensitivity and stress management became a key topic. It was obvious that the system needed to change. Politicians also got involved. Both local and federal officials began issuing statements expressing condolences to the family of Michael Williams and promising a thorough investigation. Many, especially opposition figures, used the situation to push their own police reform agendas. Lawmakers began introducing new bills to hold police more accountable for their actions, improve their training, and establish independent investigations into use-of-force incidents. However, along with the support for reform, there were also opponents of the changes in society. Conservative media and groups began to defend the actions of James Miller, arguing that he acted in accordance with protocols and that the situation he found himself in was extremely difficult and dangerous. Some publications claimed that Miller could not have known that he was a police captain and that his actions were dictated by instincts of self-defense. These arguments, however, were harshly criticized by activists and human rights defenders. Public opinion was divided. For some, the case was a blatant example of police bias and incompetence. For others, it was an example of the difficult and dangerous work of police officers, who are often forced to operate under uncertainty and stress. This polarization has only intensified the debate about how to reform the law enforcement system and what causes such tragedies. The story soon gained attention not only within the United States, but also abroad. International media outlets began to cover the incident, citing the case as an example of how racial bias in policing remains a problem in many countries. Organizations such as Amnesty International spoke out about the need for global law enforcement reforms and the fight against discrimination at all levels. Ultimately, the tragedy of Captain Michael Williams became a catalyst for national and international discussion, drawing attention to how racial bias and incompetence can lead to tragic consequences. The event, captured on video and shared by millions of people, was another milestone in the long struggle for justice and equality in law enforcement. As the tragedy involving Captain Michael Williams became a national topic of discussion, public attention turned to the investigation. Police and independent groups began to examine the events of that fateful night in detail. Questions abounded. Why did James Miller act so aggressively without verifying the captain's documents? Why did his bias outweigh his professional ethics? And most importantly, could this incident have been prevented if the police had been better trained and freed from systemic biases? Internal investigation. The first wave of investigation began immediately within the police department. Officers who were at the scene of the tragedy were called to give statements. Investigators tried to reconstruct the chronology of events using not only the testimony of colleagues but also video shot by eyewitnesses, as well as recordings from surveillance cameras installed on the streets near the scene. James Miller was suspended from duty immediately after the incident. His weapon and service materials were seized for analysis. Initial interviews with Miller revealed that he was deeply shaken by the incident. In his testimony, he claimed that he acted out of self-defense, believing that he was facing a suspect who may have been armed. He insisted that his actions were justified by the stress of the situation and fear for his own life. But serious doubts about the veracity of his claims soon began to emerge. Investigators reviewing his service history found several incidents in which Miller had been overly strict and aggressive when interacting with members of ethnic minorities. Although none of these incidents were particularly tragic, they pointed to clear signs of bias that may have played a key role in his actions on the night of Williams's murder. Bias in the police. The investigation began to raise deeper questions about systemic bias within the police force. Researchers pointed out that James Miller's actions were not random, but a symptom of a larger problem: how officers, unaware of their own biases, make decisions based on racial stereotypes. The city's police department's training and preparation for dealing with ethnic minorities was not up to modern standards, which only exacerbated the problem. An example of this was the training program that Miller went through. The academy included standard courses in conflict management and stress management, but was largely devoid of elements aimed at combating racial bias and unconscious stereotypes. This created officers who, like Miller, perceived African Americans as potential threats, even in situations where there was no objective reason for suspicion. The investigation has brought to light previous complaints about Miller's conduct, revealing incidents of his crackdown on ethnic minorities that had previously gone unpunished, raising questions about why police chiefs failed to act on warning signs and continued to turn a blind eye to instances of bias. The role of independent organizations. In addition to the police's internal investigation, independent human rights groups have launched their own investigations. Amnesty. International and other human rights groups have demanded full disclosure of all case materials, including internal records and details of previous complaints against Miller and other officers who showed signs of bias. These groups have played a key role in pressuring the authorities to conduct a transparent and fair investigation. They also insisted that the case of Captain Williams was not just an isolated tragic mistake, but a symptom of a deeper problem. Advocates emphasized that bias in the police exists at an institutional level, and without eradication, such tragedies will happen again and again. One of the key questions raised by advocates was why the city's police department had not implemented mandatory anti-bias programs, despite numerous calls and protests in the past. These programs could have prevented the tragedy if Miller had been better trained in dealing with people of different ethnicities and understood the consequences of his actions. Miller's psychological state. The investigation also examined James Miller's psychological state at the time of the incident. Independent psychologists and law enforcement experts assessed his behavior, trying to determine what factors might have influenced his perception of the situation and his decision-making. One such factor was chronic stress associated with long-term work in areas that were perceived by police as problem, due to their high percentage of African American and Hispanic residents. Experts concluded that Miller may have been experiencing what's known as secondary traumatization, in which officers confronted with tense situations eventually begin to perceive any ambiguous situation as a potential threat. But that explanation didn't justify his actions. Instead of trying to understand the situation and take steps to de-escalate it, Miller allowed his fears and biases to dictate his actions. Legal proceedings. As the investigation progressed, so did the legal process. James Miller was charged with manslaughter, but the public demanded a more severe punishment. Lawyers for Michael Williams's family insisted that Miller's actions were not a simple mistake, but a deliberate act of negligence and racial discrimination that led to the death of an innocent man. The trials were a landmark event for the entire country. The public followed every step of the case closely. For many, the case was a test of the system's willingness to admit its mistakes and take steps to eradicate racial bias in the police force. Miller's lawyers tried to defend his actions by arguing that he failed to recognize Captain Williams and acted on a perceived threat. They emphasized that the situation was tense and that Miller acted within his authority. However, such arguments fell on deaf ears among much of the public, who demanded justice for the death of an innocent man. Investigation summary. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that James Miller's mistakes were not simple. His actions were the result of a systemic problem that has existed within the police force for decades. The failure to address racial bias, a lack of training, and a lack of accountability within the police department led to a tragedy that could have been avoided. Recommendations made by the inquiry included mandatory racial discrimination and sensitivity training for all officers, and the introduction of independent monitoring of police actions. It was important not just to punish Miller, but to implement reforms that could prevent similar incidents in the future. Captain Michael Williams' family found themselves at the center of a tragedy that not only robbed them of a husband and father, but also turned their personal pain into a symbol of a national fight for justice. To them, Michael was more than just a police officer, but a man who always put his family first. even as his career took precedence. And now that he was gone, they were forced to cope not only with their loss, but with the public scrutiny that followed them every step of the way. Michael had a strong and loving family, his wife Sarah, with whom he had been married for over 20 years, and 2 children, his eldest son Jason and his youngest daughter Emma. For them, Michael was always an example of honesty, strength, and loyalty. He taught his children the importance of hard work, fairness, and respect for people, regardless of their background or status. His family knew that his job was full of difficulties and dangers, but they always believed that Michael, as an experienced officer, would be able to cope with any challenges. When news of Michael's death reached his family, their world came crashing down. His wife, Sarah, was in shock and couldn't believe that her husband, a man who had served the community for so many years, could fall victim to the very violence he had spent his life fighting. She couldn't understand how the system he had so respected could turn against him and take his life. At first, Sarah was so overwhelmed with grief that she could barely speak to the press or even to friends and family. Michael's children, Jason and Emma, were also deeply affected. For them, the loss of their father was unbearable. Jason, the eldest son, tried to remain strong for his mother and younger sister, but his own grief was enormous. He had always looked to his father as a hero, a man who not only protected their family, but also served the entire community. Now he felt that his world had been deprived of the main pillar of support. Emma, Michael's youngest daughter, was especially attached to her father. She was the person who always turned to him for advice, and now that he was gone, she felt that she had lost her main mentor and protector. Michael's funeral was attended by many people, his colleagues, friends, city officials, and thousands of citizens who wanted to pay their respects to the police captain. It was a ceremony filled with tears and grief. As Michael's coffin was lowered into the ground, his family stood by, barely holding back tears. Sarah held her children's hands, feeling their world change forever. However, despite all the grief, Michael's family quickly found themselves in the media spotlight. Journalists and reporters literally besieged their home, trying to get comments or photos. Sarah, although completely immersed in her grief, understood that this tragedy had already gone beyond their personal loss and had become a symbol for many people who are fighting for justice. The first interview Sarah gave after Michael's death was difficult for her. She could barely talk about what had happened, but she felt she had to for the sake of her husband's memory. In the interview, she emphasized the kind of person Michael was: loyal, honest, and full of love for his family and his work. She also expressed her pain and confusion about how the police system he trusted could fail him at his most critical moment. Michael always believed in justice, Sarah said, fighting back tears. He wanted to make the world a better place. He wanted the police to be a symbol of protection, not fear. But what happened to him shows that even the best of us can fall victim to the system that was supposed to protect us. After the tragedy became widely publicized, Michael's family became an important voice in the movement for police reform. Despite her grief, Sarah knew she had to continue the fight her husband had started. She frequently spoke at rallies and community events, calling for changes in the police system and for those who make mistakes due to racial bias to be held accountable. Jason, who had largely followed in his father's footsteps and studied law, now turned his energies to fighting for justice. He decided to continue his father's legacy and became an active participant in the civil rights movement. He regularly spoke on public platforms, demanding answers to the questions that had been plaguing him since his father's death. Why does racial bias still exist in the police force? Why aren't officers like James Miller held fully accountable for their actions? Emma, being the youngest, could not come to terms with what had happened for a long time. Her childhood dreams and ideas about the world were destroyed in an instant. But over time, with the support of her mother and brother, she began to find the strength to talk about what had happened. She also began to participate in actions and rallies dedicated to the memory of her father and the fight for justice. Despite her young age, Emma understood that what happened to her father should be a lesson for society, and she strove to do everything so that such tragedies would not happen again. Michael Williams' family became a symbol not only of loss, but also of the strength to come together in the face of tragedy to fight for change. They took on leadership roles in the police reform movement, recognizing that Michael's memory must be a force for change. Every speech they gave expressed the pain of loss, but also the determination to seek justice. Soon, thanks to the efforts of Michael's family and the support of community organizations, his name became associated not only with the tragedy, but also with a movement for law enforcement reform. City officials began considering proposals for new police training programs, focusing on issues of racial bias and accountability for police actions. Sarah, despite the pain of her loss, found solace in the fact that her husband was not forgotten. She knew that Michael would want his death to be meaningful, and she made it her mission to ensure that his memory would inspire change. Whenever she spoke of her husband, she emphasized his dedication and his dream for a just society. Captain Michael Williams' family remained strong despite the tragedy. They continued to fight for truth and justice, hoping that Michael's memory would inspire others to create a society free of bias and discrimination. The trial of James Miller became one of the most talked about topics in the country. People demanded justice for the death of Captain Michael Williams, and many hoped that the case would become an important precedent for law enforcement reform. But the trial was complex and emotionally charged, for both the prosecution and the defense. At stake was not only James Miller's future, but also the public's trust in the justice system. The beginning of the trial. The trial began several months after the tragedy. During this time, the media continued to discuss the details of the incident, and civil society organizations continued to protest, demanding that Miller be punished to the fullest extent of the law. The prosecutor's office brought charges of involuntary manslaughter, arguing that James Miller's actions were the result of bias, professional negligence, and excessive force. The prosecution's main argument was that Miller had no objective reason to use his weapon. They pointed to the fact that Michael Williams had shown his police captain's badge and was not aggressive. However, Miller ignored this information and acted on his preconceived notions that an African American driving an expensive car was a potential threat. Prosecutors insisted that racial stereotypes led to Williams' death. Prosecutors also presented testimony from people who were at the scene and saw the events unfold. They described how Michael Williams calmly tried to defuse the situation, while Miller acted aggressively and did not give the captain a chance to explain his position. This testimony strengthened the prosecution's argument that Miller's actions were not motivated by a real threat, but were the result of unfounded suspicion. Particular attention was paid to the video footage from the scene. The footage, taken on bystanders' cell phones, showed how quickly the situation escalated into violence, even though Michael Williams had ample evidence to prove his identity. The videos became key evidence in the trial, showing how Miller became violent almost immediately, without trying to understand the situation. Prosecutors emphasized that James Miller had every opportunity to de-escalate the conflict, but he failed to take advantage of them. Defense of James Miller. James Miller's defense was based on the claim that he acted under stress and danger, which led him to take drastic action. Miller's lawyers argued that at the time, he did not have full information about Michael Williams' identity and was operating under the assumption that he was dealing with a suspect who might be armed. They also emphasized that Miller acted in accordance with instructions for working in difficult situations. The lawyers tried to convince the court that Miller simply made a mistake while acting under stress, and that his actions were not the result of bias, but a consequence of constant pressure and intense work in dangerous areas. The defense also presented experts who argued that police officers in similar situations often find themselves in situations where they are forced to act quickly and make split-second decisions. The defense argued that Miller was unable to fully assess the situation and was acting on self-preservation instincts. However, this argument was met with criticism from the prosecution and the public, who felt that it did not justify excessive use of force. In his defense, James Miller's attorneys emphasized that he had never been involved in a fatal incident like this before and had no criminal record in his career. They sought to paint the image of an officer who simply got into a difficult situation and made a mistake, but did not act deliberately or with aggressive intent. Public pressure and the role of the media. Throughout the trial, public pressure on the legal system remained intense. People demanded justice for Michael Williams, and this created additional tension for all parties in the case. Protests outside the courthouse were common, and representatives of human rights organizations regularly spoke out in favor of the prosecution. They emphasized that the case was a symbol of how racial prejudice continues to exist in the police force, and that it should serve as a lesson to the entire system. The media also played a major role, covering every day of the trial. Television programs and online publications continued to publish articles about the proceedings, interviews with experts, and comments from public figures. For many people, the case became a litmus test of how the justice system can deal with problems related to racial discrimination and abuse of power in the police. Michael Williams' family was very involved in the trial, attending every hearing. Their presence symbolized that they wanted to see not only the perpetrator punished, but also changes to the system that allowed this tragedy to happen. Michael's wife, Sarah, made several statements to the press, emphasizing that their family wanted justice, but also hoped that this case would lead to reform. Sentence. After weeks of trial, the jury returned a verdict. James Miller was found guilty of manslaughter, but not of premeditated aggression or racial discrimination, as the public demanded. The judge noted that Miller's actions, although the result of poor judgment, were not intentional, but still led to tragic consequences. Miller was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Reaction to the verdict was mixed. Many were pleased that Miller was found guilty and given a real sentence, but some civil rights groups and protesters felt the sentence was too lenient and called for a more severe sentence, given that Miller's actions were racially motivated. Consequences of the lawsuit. Despite the verdict, the case left a deep mark on the public consciousness. It resurfaced questions about police reform, the need for tighter oversight of officers, and better training. Many began calling for mandatory programs to combat racial bias and the creation of independent commissions to investigate abuses of power. Michael Williams's family took the verdict with a grain of salt. For them, the trial was not only a fight to punish the perpetrator, but also to remember Michael and ensure his death was not in vain. Sarah Williams expressed disappointment that the verdict did not take into account the gravity of what happened, but also acknowledged that the trial was an important step toward change in the law enforcement system. Conclusions. The case against James Miller was a turning point in the national conversation about policing. It showed that despite progress, racial bias remains a serious problem that requires attention and reform. The justice system, while slow to act, has taken the first step toward recognizing these problems and preventing such tragedies from happening again. The death of Captain Michael Williams left a deep mark on people and prompted society to think seriously about the need for police reform and overcoming prejudice. The incident not only exposed deep-rooted issues of racial bias, but also showed how one tragedy can trigger a wave of change on a national level. Consequences for the police. After the trial and sentencing of James Miller, it became clear that Michael Williams's death would not go unnoticed by the entire law enforcement system. Cities across the country began to implement reforms aimed at eliminating racial bias in policing. These reforms included mandatory anti-bias programs and new protocols to de-escalate conflicts. Captain Williams' death became a symbol of the need for change. The introduction of independent commissions to investigate police brutality and abuse of power was one of the major victories for activists who lobbied for reform. These measures gave the public confidence that cases of use of force would be assessed impartially, without internal pressure from the police. The legacy of Michael Williams. For many, Michael became a symbol of integrity, dedication, and the fight for justice. His family and friends, despite the tragedy, were able to focus their efforts on continuing his mission to create a fairer system. Scholarships and educational programs in his name have helped young people from disadvantaged areas get the opportunity to study law and join the police force, changing the system from the inside. Michael's daughter, Emma, continued her father's work, becoming one of the active participants in the reform movement. Her powerful speeches and determination became an inspiration to many young people who wanted to change the world for the better. She reminded everyone that even one life can become a driving force for change that will make society more just and safe. Conclusion. The death of Michael Williams showed that even those who have dedicated their lives to protecting others can become victims of the system they are trying to change. The case opened many eyes to the problems that need to be addressed immediately: systemic bias, ineffective police training, and a lack of transparency in investigations. But most importantly, The case inspired many to fight for justice. Reforms sparked by protests, and the movement sparked by the captain's death, had, albeit slowly, begun to change the way police carried out their duties. Laws aimed at protecting citizens' rights and improving police training were a first step toward creating a fairer system. But there was still much work to do. Captain Williams will live on in the hearts of those who knew him and those who learned about his life through this tragedy. His family continues to fight for change so that his death will not have been in vain. And while the pain of his loss will never go away, Michael's legacy is one of fighting for the justice he so desperately wanted to see in his world.